Section 32 of the Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Céline Major. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. Section 32. Rainford in the Subterranean. Tom Rain reached the bottom of the stairs in perfect safety, and as he had carefully noted the geography of the subterranean when he traversed it an hour previously with Old Death, he experienced but little difficulty in threading his path along it, even amidst the black darkness through which he literally seemed to be pushing his way. In a few minutes his progress was stopped by a wall, which his extended arms encountered, and he now knew that he had reached the extremity communicating with the house in Turnmill Street. Having succeeded in grasping the wire which, passing through the top of the vault, was connected with the mechanism of the clock overhead, he pulled it vigorously. But the machinery moved not. Then, for the first time during this eventful night, the highwayman became appalled at the dangers on which he had entered. Again he tugged at the wire. It snapped short close by the roof, and the long piece thus broken off fell at his feet. "Damnation!" cried Rainford, and he stamped impatiently on the cold, damp stones. Suddenly it struck him that there might be one wire to move the clock over the opening at the head of the iron ladder, and another wire to move it away from that opening. He accordingly began to feel with his hands for this second wire, the existence of which was suggested by his imagination, but at the end of a minute he was compelled to admit to himself that it did indeed exist only in imagination. No such second wire was to be found. He then hastily ascended the ladder, and endeavoured to hurl the clock from off the opening which it covered. But the huge machine was as solidly fixed there as if it had formed a portion of the vaulted roof itself. Escape seemed to grow every moment more hopeless. And now came the appalling thought that Old Death and the doctor would soon have sufficient time to repair from the house in Red Lion Street to that in Turnmill Street, and thus secure against him the avenue covered by the clock, even if it were not sufficiently secure already. What was he to do? Again and again he tried to force away the heavy clock, but there it stood, immovable, and when he paused to reflect, its steady, monotonous ticking fell ominously upon his ears. At length it struck him that he would retrace his way to the other extremity, force up the trap door leading to Old Death's bedchamber, and, with a pistol in each hand, dare everything. But what if the trap door were secured on the other side? No, he remembered to have observed that there was not a bolt nor a bar to break the level of its upper surface as it fitted in flush with the floor. Encouraged by the scintillation of hope that thus gleamed in upon him, Rainford hurried back to the other end of the subterranean, ascended the spiral staircase, grasped his pistols, and listened attentively. All was still in the room above, not a murmur of a voice, nor the creaking of a footstep. He then slowly and carefully drew back the bolt of the trap door, and tried to raise it. But it moved not. He applied additional force, under the impression that some heavy piece of furniture might have been dragged over the trap; but still it was as motionless as the thick, solid, substantial flooring in which it was set. Rainford returned the pistols to his pockets, so that nothing might impede the application of all his strength to the task on which his liberty depended. But no, the door moved not. The highwayman bit his under lip almost till the blood started forth, for he felt that his calmness was abandoning him. Then how bitterly did he repent the course which he had adopted after his interruption in the laboratory by the appearance of Dr. Lascelles. Instead of trusting himself to that hideous subterranean, he should have essayed an escape by means of the front rooms of the house. Regrets were, however, useless. He must act, and not waste time in self-reproach. Yes, he must act, if he would not die in that dreadful place where the vindictiveness of Old Death would be sure to leave him. To act! Oh, how easy to think of acting! But how was he to put his thought into execution? A stone pavement beneath, stone walls on either side, a stone ceiling overhead, at one end an avenue closed by a huge clock, at the other a trap door evidently secured on the outside. These were the obstacles. These were the barriers against which he had to contend. And what were the implements within his power? His 2 hands, a clasp knife, and a pair of pistols. Quick as lightning, the idea flashed across him that the iron ladder at the other extremity of the subterranean was movable, and that it would serve him as a battering ram. Rejoiced at this thought, he once more retraced his way along the vaulted passage, and eagerly grasped the ladder. His conjecture was right. It merely hooked on to 2 iron rings fixed into the masonry just below the aperture covered by the clock, and, heavy though it was, yet Rainford now bore it as easily as if it were of wood, for renewed hope had rendered him strong and bold as a lion. It was, however, somewhat difficult to drag the iron ladder up the spiral staircase; but in a few minutes this portion of the task was accomplished, and Rainford now prepared to assault the secret entrance to Old Death's dwelling. Placing himself in such a position that he might deal a vigorous blow upwards with his ponderous engine, and then be able to seize his pistols the instant they might be required, he went to work with a stout arm and a still stouter heart. Once, twice, thrice, and up swung the ladder. That single blow was sufficient, and the trap door burst from its setting. Quick as thought, Rainford seized his 2 pistols, and thrusting up the trap, ascended the last steps of the spiral staircase. Throwing back the carpet, which had been replaced over the trap door, he found, to his infinite surprise, that there was no resistance to his egress from that subterranean where, at one time, it seemed probable that he was destined to find a tomb; and gazing rapidly around the room, he neither perceived Old Death nor the doctor, nor, indeed, a single living soul. Recovering all his wonted calmness, he proceeded to examine the trap door, for the purpose of ascertaining how it had been secured against him; and on close inspection he observed a spring bolt let into the side of the trap door in such a way that, when the trap was closed, it neither appeared above nor below it. This bolt was either held back within the wood, or made to fly into a hole made to receive it in the beam against which the trap door closed, by means of 2 screws that could easily be pressed inwards. But the force of Rainford's battering ram had unsettled this artfully contrived piece of mechanism. It was clear that some one had secured the trap door, because even if the spring bolt had flown into its socket by accident, still the carpet could not have spread out of its own accord. Moreover, when Rainford had retreated to the subterranean, he had heard footsteps and voices in Old Death's room. It therefore struck him that those who had so secured the trap door had departed to protect the avenue of escape in Turnmill Street, in the confidence that the said trap door was too strong to be forced. Nevertheless, it was necessary to guard against the possibility of an ambuscade, and Tom held his pistols in a manner calculated to render them instantaneously available. He determined to proceed by way of the laboratory, but on trying the door, he found it locked. Without an instant's hesitation, he forced it open with one vigorously applied blow of his foot; but here again he encountered no resistance. Passing through the laboratory, he tried the door by which he had seen Dr. Lascelles appear and disappear again so abruptly; and this time he was spared the necessity of violent exertion, for the door was not locked. He now entered a passage leading to a flight of stairs, down which he hastened, and reached a kind of hall, from whence the street door opened. But he did not immediately issue forth. He experienced an invincible curiosity to ascertain if Old Death had in reality been released from the state of bondage in which he had left him; and, forgetting the terrible dangers whence he had escaped with so much difficulty, he re-ascended the staircase. The appearance of this part of the house was dirty and neglected. Indeed, it afforded no evidence that the tenement was inhabited at all, but conveyed quite the contrary impression. The fan light above the front door was boarded over, and thus the hall itself was nearly dark, the only light it enjoyed being admitted through the ill-closed joints of the boarding just mentioned. The paper was falling away from the walls of the staircase, and dust and dirt had accumulated wherever the hand touched or the eye could penetrate. On regaining the landing on the first floor, Tom Rain tried a door opposite to that by which he had issued from the laboratory, but it was locked. He forced it open, and found himself, as he suspected he should, in the very room where he had left Old Death, for that apartment had 2 doors. And to his ineffable surprise, Old Death was still there, still sitting in the chair to which he had been fastened with a strong cord, and that cord had not been removed. The head of the fence was bent forward, and hung, or rather drooped, upon his breast. The highwayman was alarmed, and hastened towards him. But the moment he caught a glimpse of his features, he started back horror stricken, and stupefied as it were by the hideous spectacle that presented itself to his view. For the old man's countenance was fearfully distorted, and nearly black. The eyes protruded from their sockets, and seemed staring on vacancy, and the under jaw had fallen. "Holy God! He is dead!" ejaculated Rainford at length. "And I have killed him!" At that instant the door leading from the inner apartment was slowly and cautiously opened, and the highwayman, yielding to a natural impulse, turned and fled abruptly by the one communicating with the passage, and which he had forced open a few moments previously. This movement on his part was so sudden and so quickly executed that he did not perceive the person who was entering the room, but whether that person observed him or not he was unaware. Descending the stairs 3 or 4 at a time, the highwayman quitted the house by the front door, and did not breathe freely until he had closed it behind him and found himself at length in the open street. Dauntless, daring as he was, the idea that he had caused, though unintentionally, the death of the old fence, prostrated for a time the powers of a naturally vigorous mind, and horror threw all his thoughts into chaotic confusion. He did not even pause a moment to examine, as well as the darkness of the hour would have permitted him, the outward appearance of the house which he had just left, but hurried away as quickly as he could go from the vicinity of a place where he had seen and undergone so much in such an incredibly short space of time. For it was about 1 o'clock when he and Old Death had entered the house in Turnmill Street, and St. Paul's proclaimed the hour of 3, as Rainford crossed Smithfield Market. End of Section 32. Read by Céline Major. Section 33 of the Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Céline Major. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. Section 33. Mrs. Martha Slingsby. The reader who is acquainted with the West End of the great metropolis of the British Empire cannot have failed to notice the air of gloomy grandeur which characterises the aristocratic mansions of Old Burlington Street. The dingy brick fronts, the massive doors, all of a sombre colour, the windows, darkened by heavy hangings, and the dead silence which seems to prevail within, produce upon the passer-by a strange and almost melancholy effect. There is nothing bustling, nothing cheerful in that street. On the brightest day of summer its aspect is cold, mournful, prison-like. It seems to be the last refuge of the aristocracy of the old school, that aristocracy which still clings to all its ancient prejudices, its haughty notions, its exclusive pride, an aristocracy which finds its influence each day narrowing into a smaller compass, in proportion as that of the masses expands around it. And God grant that everything in the shape of hereditary aristocracy may shortly expire altogether, crushed by the weight of new interests and modern civilization. In one of those gloomy-looking houses of Old Burlington Street dwelt Mrs. Slingsby, a lady of about 42, but who, enhancing by art a natural conservation of beauty truly miraculous in a female of her age, seemed at least 5 or 6 years younger. Her hair was very dark, and as she wore the sweetest French caps that Parisian fashion could suggest, she was invested with that air which bewilders the common observer between its admirable coquettishness and its matronly sedateness. Her complexion was clear and delicate, and a careful but regular use of cosmetics concealed those incipient wrinkles which appeared at the corners of her eyelids. Her teeth were perfect, white, and even, and her figure, though upon a large scale, was maintained in fine symmetry by the skill of her dressmaker. She had naturally a splendid bust, and as she usually wore very high dresses, she was the better enabled to maintain its appearance of youthful firmness in spite of the prominent expansion it had experienced as the lady herself increased in years. Mrs. Martha Slingsby was the aunt of Mr. Clarence Villiers, the lover of Adelais Torrens. When very young, she was sacrificed by her parents to a gentleman double her age, and who acquired a fortune while he lost his health in India. Shortly after this union, circumstances compelled Mr. Slingsby to return to Calcutta, and his youthful wife accompanied him. There they remained about 8 years, at the expiration of which period Mr. Slingsby died of a broken heart, his immense wealth having been suddenly and entirely swept away by the failure of a great mercantile and banking establishment in the Anglo-Indian capital. Mrs. Slingsby, however, found a friend in the person of Sir Henry Courtenay, a baronet who had long held a high office in the Council of India, and who was about to return to England, having relinquished the cares of employment in the public service. He was upwards of 50 at that period, a widower, but having a family of young children. The moment that the misfortunes of Mrs. Slingsby were reported to him by a mutual friend, Sir Henry proposed to her that she should enter his family to supply, as far as possible, the attentions of the mother whom the children had lost. This offer was gratefully accepted, and Mrs. Slingsby, who had no offspring of her own, returned to England with the baronet. For some years after her arrival in London, she remained in the family of Sir Henry Courtenay, where she appeared to be treated as a near relation, and not as a dependant. But when the boys and girls were old enough to be placed at school, she removed to the house in Old Burlington Street, in which we now find her. Rumour declared that she was enabled to take so handsome an establishment, in consequence of the sudden and unexpected recovery of a portion of that fortune which was supposed to have been irretrievably swallowed up in the failure of the bank at Calcutta, and the loss of which had broken her husband's heart. At all events, she paid her way regularly, and was famed for her numerous charities. Calumny had never assailed her, for she was so regular in her religious duties, so retired in her mode of life, so ready to assist the deserving poor, so constant in her donations to all humane and philanthropic institutions, and so zealous a patroness of missionary and Bible societies, that her neighbours looked upon her as a very pattern of Christian virtue. Between herself and the Courtenay family, the most sincere attachment appeared to exist. Whenever the young gentlemen and the young ladies returned home for the holidays, they invariably passed a week with her whom they almost looked upon as a mother, and Sir Henry himself, in speaking of her to his friends, seemed to take a delight in eulogizing the manner in which she had performed her duty towards his children. The consequence was that his relations and acquaintances echoed these praises elsewhere, and Mrs. Martha Slingsby was quoted at the West End as the perfect model of a good and excellent woman. Thus, at the age of 42, Mrs. Slingsby had escaped that ordeal through which so many beautiful widows are doomed to pass, we mean the whisperings of calumny. Not a breath had ever sullied her fame, not a hint had ever been dropped to her disparagement. Scandal seemed to avoid her threshold as an evil spirit is supposed to recoil from the vicinity of the temple of worship. We must observe that Sir Henry Courtenay was now close upon 63, 13 years having elapsed since Mrs. Slingsby had entered his family in India. He was nevertheless a fine man, on whose brow time seemed to sit lightly, considering how great a portion of his mortal career was already run. It is true that he wore false teeth and false hair, but art had rendered those substitutes so natural in appearance that few suspected they were really false. Elegant in his manners, endowed with a mind which had treasured up the richest stores of intellectual wealth, fascinating in his conversation, and evincing in his attire the taste of a polished gentleman, Sir Henry Courtenay was one of the brightest stars of the fashionable world, a favourite at court, and welcome in every gay circle. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of that day which followed the events related in the few preceding chapters, that Mrs. Martha Slingsby was seated in her elegantly furnished drawing-room, revising the list of her usual Christmas donations to the humane, philanthropic, and religious societies. Adelais and Rosamond Torrens were seated one on each side of her, and aiding their kind friend in her pious task. Rosamond held in her hand a memorandum book from which she read the names of the various associations alluded to. Mrs. Slingsby had a cash box open before her, and Adelais made entries, according to this lady's dictation, in another memorandum book. The two beautiful girls appeared to be the daughters of the elegant and handsome woman who sat between them, and there was so much sweetness in the countenances of all three, so much animation, and so much modesty, that a painter would have been rejoiced to depict the group as charity dictating to benevolence and mercy. "Proceed, dear Rosamond," said Mrs. Slingsby, when Adelais had finished a note in her memorandum book. "The Orphans' Children's Free School Association, madam," read the young maiden thus addressed, "and last year you gave 10 guineas." "This Christmas I shall subscribe 15, my loves," observed Mrs. Slingsby, in a mild and silvery tone of voice. "There is no duty so sweet, so holy as to contribute to the religious instruction of those poor creatures who are deprived of their natural protectors. Besides, the committee have manifested the most praiseworthy readiness to attend to any suggestions which I may deem it right to offer. For instance, it was the custom until lately to have 3 multiplication table lessons to only 1 Bible reading, and this, you must admit, my loves, was very indiscreet. I will not use a harsher term. But in consequence of my recommendation, the dear children have now 3 Bible readings to 1 multiplication table lesson. Have you written down 15 guineas, my dear?" she inquired, turning towards Adelais. A reply was given in the affirmative, and Mrs. Slingsby wrapped the amount up in an elegant sheet of rose-coloured paper, and having noted in pencil the contents of the little packet, added it to several others which were ranged before her on the table. Rosamond then read the next item. "The Poor Authors' Assistance Fund, and last year you gave 5 guineas, madam." "And this year I shall only send 2, my loves," said Mrs. Slingsby. "Authors and journalists are ruining the country, both politically and morally, as fast as they can. They are writing for the people, and against the aristocracy; and this, my loves, is a crying abomination. Heaven forgive me for speaking in such harsh terms, so inconsistent with pious meekness and Christian forbearance; but it would disturb the patience of a saint to behold the attacks made by these men upon our blessed Constitution, our Holy Church and its most necessary union with the State, the prerogatives of our monarch, the rights of the upper classes, the privileges of wealth, and all those institutions which were perfected by the wisdom of our ancestors. Do you understand me, my loves?" "Oh, quite, madam," answered Adelais, who already began to look upon liberal-minded authors and journalists as a set of incarnate fiends banded against everything worth preserving in society. "Besides, my dear girls," added Mrs. Slingsby, "the Poor Authors' Assistance Fund does not publish a report of its proceedings, nor a list of those who subscribe to it; and, under all circumstances, I think that I should be acting more consistently with my duties as a Christian and as an Englishwoman devoted to the blessed institutions of her happy country, to decline any donation whatever to a society encouraging infidels and republicans. So you may draw a pen through the name, Rosamond, love. There! Now my conscience is at rest. Which is the next item?" "The Distressed Milliners' Friends Society, madam," was the answer. "That is another association from which I must withdraw my patronage," observed Mrs. Slingsby, her countenance losing its serene placidity in an air of severity. "You are too young and too pure-minded to understand my motives, dear girls; but when I tell you that most of these distressed milliners are very naughty women, you will perceive the justice of my conduct. And then they endeavour to make their penury an excuse for their turpitude. Oh, how wicked, how sinful is human nature, my loves! Erase that name also, dear Rosamond. And now what is the next?" "The South Sea Island Bible Circulating Society, madam, and last year you gave 20 guineas." "That is indeed a blessed institution!" exclaimed Mrs. Slingsby, turning her eyes piously upward; "and it is to this society's rooms that we are going in the evening to hear that estimable man, Mr. Joshua Sheepshanks, give an account of the mission from which he has just returned. I shall increase my donation by 5 guineas in this instance." Adelais accordingly wrote down 35 guineas, which sum was duly wrapped up in rose-coloured paper and added to the other packets. Rosamond then read the next item in her memorandum book. "The Naked Savages General Clothing Association, and last year——" "Pardon me, dearest girl," said Mrs. Slingsby, "I cannot support that society any longer. There is in its title a word most offensive to the ears of decency; and I do not know how I could ever have been prevailed upon to lend it the countenance of my name and the aid of my purse. Besides, I do not think the object of the institution is useful; For in India one sees the natives of the lower orders in the country districts going about in a state bordering on nudity, and one gets so accustomed to it that it produces no disagreeable effect whatever. The name of the association is decidedly indelicate. But there is nothing repulsive in the fact of savages going about in a state of nudity. You may strike out the item, Rosamond, love." "I have done so, madam. The next is the—" Rosamond was interrupted by a loud knock at the front door, which resounded through the house. In a few moments Sir Henry Courtenay was announced. Section 34. of the Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Céline Major. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. Section 34. The Pious Lady. The baronet entered the room with a smiling countenance and a graceful salutation. "Pray be seated, ladies," he exclaimed, addressing himself to Adelais and Rosamond, who had risen from their chairs. "My dear Mrs. Slingsby, I need not inquire concerning your health, for you look quite charming this morning." "You know, Sir Henry, that I am not pleased by flattery," said the lady, in a reproachful tone. "A thousand pardons, my dear madam," returned the baronet; "but you must remember that we have now been acquainted for some years, that our friendship is not only of yesterday's date, and that if I venture on a little freedom with you, it is as a brother might address himself to a sister for whom he has the highest esteem. Yes, ladies," he added, turning towards Adelais and Rosamond, "this excellent woman, this almost angel, as I may denominate her, was a mother to my children, and that is a circumstance which I can never forget." "You attach more importance than is necessary, Sir Henry, to the mere performance of a duty," observed Mrs. Slingsby, in a calm and modest manner. Adelais and Rosamond exchanged glances which seemed to say, "Admirable woman! We already love her as much as if she were our maternal parent." "But I am afraid that I am interrupting an occupation of more value than my idle chit-chat can possibly prove to be," exclaimed Sir Henry, who surveyed Rosamond with an ill-concealed admiration. "Some useful or pious labour was engaging you young ladies, no doubt; for in the society of Mrs. Slingsby not a moment is likely to be passed without producing a benefit to at least some section of the great human family." "The anniversary of that holy day on which the Saviour of mankind suffered on the cross is approaching, Sir Henry," observed Mrs. Slingsby, in a tone and manner suiting the solemnity of her remark; "and you know that I am in the habit of forwarding my mite at this season of the year to those humane, religious, or philanthropic institutions which deserve support." "I never forget any of those pious duties which you have taken upon yourself, my dear madam," said the baronet; "and, indeed, the object of my present visit is— But the act of charity of which I am desirous to make you the instrument," he added, glancing towards the young ladies, "involves details of so painful a nature that——" "I understand you, Sir Henry," interrupted Mrs. Slingsby; "and this consideration for the feelings of those who are not accustomed to look upon the dark side of the world's picture is worthy of your generous disposition. Adelais, my love, Rosamond, dearest, pray retire for a short period." The request was conveyed in a manner so affectionate, and with such witching softness, that the maidens to whom it was addressed could not help embracing their kind friend ere they left the room. The moment the door had closed behind them, Sir Henry drew his chair close to that of Mrs. Slingsby, and, placing his arm round her waist, imprinted a kiss of burning desire upon her lips. "Martha, you are really surprisingly beautiful to day," he whispered in her ear. "Do you think so, Henry?" she murmured, her eyes lighting up with the excitement of that contiguity. "And yet I have fancied that your behaviour has been somewhat cold towards me of late." "Do not entertain such a suspicion, my dearest creature!" exclaimed the baronet, plunging his hand into the bosom of this pious lady's dress. "Had either of us a right to complain, I think it would be myself, for——" "Oh, do not reproach me, Henry!" she murmured, abandoning herself to his lustful toyings. "But ever since the difficulty I experienced in producing that last miscarriage, I have been so frightened lest——" "Nonsense, Martha! Do not alarm yourself without a cause," interrupted the baronet. "Even if it did come to that, the matter could be easily arranged. A few weeks' retirement into the country, on some charitable mission, ha! ha!" "True," said the frail fair one; "but the chances of detection! Oh! I shudder when I think of it. Consider how admirably we have hitherto managed." "And how completely the world is deceived in regard to us," added the baronet, laughing. "There is nothing like a religious demeanour to throw dust in people's eyes. Were a syllable of scandal breathed against you, you have the patrons of all those humbugging societies to defend you. But what are you going to do with yourself this evening? Can you not devote a few hours to me?" "I wish I could, Henry," returned the lady; "but it is impossible. A dreadful bore named Sheepshanks is going to entertain the devout with his nonsense, and it would seem so odd, so very odd, if I were not present." "It is now upwards of 3 weeks since we slept together," said the baronet, in a tone of reproach. "Yes, but you know that I cannot pretend too often to pass the entire night by the sick bed of some poor woman," returned Mrs. Slingsby. "And now, dearest Henry, I have a favour to ask of you." "Name it," said the baronet, in a low murmur, for his passions were furiously excited by his voluptuous toyings with his mistress. "You must write me a cheque for £1,000," replied the lady, winding her arms round his neck, and then literally gluing her lips to his. "Oh, you are becoming very extravagant, Martha," said the baronet; "but I suppose I must yield." "You are a dear, generous fellow," murmured the lady, as she suffered herself to be led to the sofa. A quarter of an hour afterwards, Mrs. Slingsby rang the bell, and a sleek, comfortable looking footman answered the summons. The lady was then sitting, in her usual quiet, placid manner, in a chair near the table, and the baronet was placed at a respectful distance from her. "Bring up luncheon, James," said Mrs. Slingsby. "Sir Henry, you will take a glass of champagne? I know you are somewhat partial to it. But a decanter of water for me, James." "Yes, madam." And the domestic withdrew. In a short time he returned, bearing a tray, which he placed on the table, and then retired again. Having paid their respects to the cold viands placed before them, the lady and gentleman did honour to the champagne, both drinking out of the same glass, the servant having only brought up one of the description suited to that particular wine. When the collation was ended, Mrs. Slingsby drank a tumbler of water to take away the smell of the champagne from her mouth, but she did not appear to relish the limpid beverage quite so well as the rich juice of Epernay. The baronet then wrote the lady a cheque on his banker for £1,000, and having made a certain little appointment with her for a particular evening in the ensuing week, and at a place of rendezvous as convenient as it was safe, he took his departure. Immediately after Sir Henry had left the abode of Mrs. Slingsby, that lady's housekeeper sought the presence of her mistress, and was forthwith admitted to the private interview which she desired. "What is it, Magdalen?" inquired Mrs. Slingsby, when the housekeeper stood in her presence. "I'm sorry, ma'am, to have anything unpleasant for such ears as yours," was the answer; "but I am convinced that a scullion girl is in the family way." "Magdalen!" ejaculated the pious lady, horrified at the mere idea. "Oh, do not utter anything so uncharitable!" "I am sure of it, ma'am, I repeat," persisted the housekeeper. "In fact, I've had my suspicions about it for a long, long time; and now I'm certain." "Magdalen," said Mrs. Slingsby, in a tone of profound solemnity, "this is a dreadful occurrence to take place in a house which, I may safely assert, has never yet been tainted with the breath of scandal—at least so long as I have occupied it. Are you sure that your conjecture is right?" "I would take my salvation oath that it is, ma'am," responded the housekeeper. "That expression on your part is incorrect, Magdalen," observed Mrs. Slingsby, in a tone of mild reproach. "But I of course believe all you tell me relative to that miserable, degraded girl. Let her be sent from the house this minute, Magdalen—this very minute. Pay her any wages that may be due to her, and inform her that her box shall be sent after her to her parents, with a note acquainting them of the reason for her abrupt discharge. "She has no parents, ma'am. She is an orphan." "But she has friends, no doubt?" said Mrs. Slingsby inquiringly. "No, ma'am. I took her from the workhouse, on the recommendation of a lady, a friend of yours, ma'am, who visits them kind of places on a Sunday, distributing hymn books. Disagreeable as the duty is, it must nevertheless be performed, Magdalen. And that duty, so incumbent upon us, is to turn the lost girl into the street, pay her wages. She has nothing to receive, ma'am. I advanced her money to buy herself decent clothes." "Then let her go away without any money, since she has none to receive," interrupted Mrs. Slingsby. "To give her a single shilling were to encourage her in that shameless career of profligacy whereon she has already so far entered." "Your orders shall be obeyed, ma'am," replied Magdalen; and she withdrew to execute them, for she had a spite against the poor scullery girl, who had been intriguing with one of this over-particular housekeeper's own lovers. Shortly after this little occurrence which we have just related, Mr. Clarence Villiers made his appearance in Old Burlington Street. He found his aunt alone in the drawing-room, and the moment he had paid his respects to her, he inquired for his much beloved Adelais and her sister. "They are safe and well, Clarence," answered Mrs. Slingsby. "But before I summon them, it will be necessary that we should have a little conversation relative to the proper and prudent course now to be adopted. Sit down, Clarence, and grant me your attention." The young man obeyed, and prepared to listen with all the patience he could call to his aid, for much as he respected and really loved his aunt, whom he looked upon as a pattern of moral excellence and virtue, he nevertheless experienced the anxiety of a lover to find himself in the presence of Adelais. "I shall not detain you long, Clarence," resumed Mrs. Slingsby, "and it is for your own good that I am about to speak. In the first place, I feel it due to myself to explain to you that, in receiving those young ladies into my house the other evening, and at so late an hour, I was influenced solely by that affection which I entertained towards you, and by my conviction of your thorough integrity of purpose. The mere fact of my bringing those almost friendless girls to seek an asylum with you, dear aunt," said Clarence, "must prove to you how careful I was of their reputation. And it was to assist your upright views that I received them without a moment's hesitation," added Mrs. Slingsby. "You know that if I had the means, you should long ago have been put in possession of a sufficient fortune to have enabled you to compete with Mr. Francis Curtis in bidding with the mercenary Mr. Torrens for his daughter. But although my income is sufficient for my wants, and, thank heaven, for a few little purposes of charity——" "My dear aunt," interrupted Villiers, "wherefore renew an explanation so unnecessary?" "Because I would not have you suppose, Clarence, that I would for an instant sanction my underhand proceedings in respect to your union with Miss Torrens, had it been possible to have ensured that aim by means of her father's consent. But," continued Mrs. Slingsby, "I conceive that there are so many extenuating features in the case that I cannot regret having granted an asylum to that dear girl and her sister, and in thus securing them alike from the perils of London and from the pursuit of their father." "Your kindness towards them will render their hearts as grateful as mine is," exclaimed the young man warmly. "During the few days that my house has become their home," continued Mrs. Slingsby, "they have endeared themselves to me by their affectionate dispositions, their tranquil habits, their readiness to please, and a thousand amiable qualities; and therefore, for their own sakes as well as yours, I am ready to do all in my power to serve them. But should Mr. Torrens happen to discover their abode, conceive the scandal that would be created—the observations that would be excited." "My dear aunt, I would not for worlds compromise you in any way," ejaculated Clarence; "but still——" "Do not fear that I am anxious to rid myself of their charming company," added Mrs. Slingsby. "I am only desirous that you yourself should adopt due caution, so as to avoid being followed hither by any one who might be employed by Mr. Torrens to watch you." "No imprudence on my part shall mar the success of my plans," returned Clarence. "The banns have been published at St. George's once already; and next Sunday will be the second time. It is scarcely probable that Mr. Torrens will become aware of this circumstance, and he certainly would not, without any previous hint, conjecture that the preliminaries for our union had been adopted in so fashionable a church as that in Hanover Square," added Clarence with a smile. "Let 2 more Sundays pass without the abode of my Adelais being discovered, and she will then become indissolubly mine." "Have you seen any more of your kind friend, who so generously took your part the other evening?" inquired Mrs. Slingsby, after a pause. "Captain Sparks!" exclaimed Clarence. "Not since I met him, as I before informed you, at a tavern in the Strand." "Avoid taverns, my dear nephew," interrupted Mrs. Slingsby, a cloud overspreading her countenance; "for, by all I have ever heard or read concerning them, they are fearful sinks of iniquity." "Oh, not the respectable taverns, aunt," replied Villiers. "I had purchased a very handsome pair of pistols to present to the Captain as a token of my esteem, and then I recollected that I was totally unacquainted with his address. I flew to the great army agents at Charing Cross, but there was no such name as Captain Sparks in the list. Well, I thought he might be in the Navy, and off I went to the Admiralty; but no Captain Sparks. I therefore considered it fortunate when I accidentally met him in a tavern which I entered to procure some refreshment. He positively refused to accept the pistols, declaring that he had done nothing more than I should have done for him under similar circumstances. But I thought there was something singular in the merry laugh which burst from his lips when I proffered the case containing the pistols. However, he is an excellent-hearted fellow, and I shall always hold myself his debtor. We walked together, on that occasion, as far as my own lodgings in Bridge Street, and he entertained me with a perfect fund of anecdote all the time. Indeed, I am as much pleased with him as I feel myself under an obligation to him." "Gratitude is a rare virtue in this world," remarked Mrs. Slingsby, who seldom lost an opportunity of letting drop a moral maxim. "And now," she continued with a smile, "having taxed your patience to such an extent, I must give you the well-merited award. My kind and generous friend, Sir Henry Courtenay, has advanced me a certain sum of money, one half of which I require for charitable purposes of my own, but the other I place at your disposal, to enable you to hire and furnish a suitable dwelling to receive your bride. Take this cheque, and to morrow you can bring me my moiety." "Oh, my dear aunt, have you borrowed of your friends to assist me?" exclaimed Clarence, overwhelmed by so much apparent generosity. "Not entirely to assist you, my dear nephew," was the calm reply, "but partly, as you perceive, for myself. However, say no more about the trifle which I present to you, and reward me by making a good use of it." Clarence embraced his relative. Adelais and Rosamond were then summoned, and the lovers were soon happy in each other's society. We must now afford the reader some explanation relative to Mrs. Slingsby's behaviour towards her nephew, and, in so doing, we shall throw additional light upon the character of this lady. She was of a crafty, calculating disposition, and seldom performed any act, however trivial, without a selfish motive. The fact was that she had a very difficult part to play. Devoured with raging desires, she was compelled to adopt a calm, modest, and reserved exterior, and to conceal her debauchery beneath the cloak of religion. Sir Henry Courtenay was necessary to her in more ways than one—necessary as a lover, and necessary as a treasurer, for she was totally dependent upon him in a pecuniary sense. The report relative to the recovery of a portion of her late husband's fortune was a mere fabrication to account for her comfortable mode of life. Still she considered her position to be so dangerous, that she was compelled to fortify it by all possible means. She really loved her nephew, for it often occurs that women of her description are capable of a strong attachment of this nature; but even had she entertained no regard for him at all, she would have pretended to do so, because he was necessary to her. He was a means by which she could constantly trumpet forth her charitable deeds, while she herself appeared unconscious that they ever transpired. Taking good care that he should know all she did in the cause of religion or humanity, she led him to believe in a great many things which she did not do, and the consequence was that Clarence was never wearied of repeating, wherever he went, those praises which he conscientiously considered to be his aunt's due. Now, when a near relation corroborates the statements made by friends, those statements receive a weight which places them beyond the pale of disbelief. Thus the world read Mrs. Slingsby's character as Clarence himself read it and reported it; and with such an amount of testimony in her favour, she could defy scandal. Even the most maliciously inclined dared not to venture a shake of the head, nor a shrug of the shoulder; for surely her own nephew must know whether she was as good as she was represented. Relations seldom praise each other behind their backs, and when a dashing young fellow like Clarence was so enthusiastic in praise of his aunt, it was that he was thoroughly convinced of the sterling merit of her character. Such would have been the arguments opposed to any detractive observations that scandal might dare to let drop concerning Mrs. Slingsby. The lady, finding her nephew so necessary to her interests, naturally sought not only to maintain the most complete deception relative to herself in his mind, but also to attach him towards her by substantial acts of kindness. Thus she had readily consented to receive Adelais and Rosamond into her house, to oblige Clarence; and she now, with the same interested motive, made him a handsome pecuniary present. She let him know that she had been compelled to borrow the money, in advance of her imaginary income, to enhance the value of the gift, and also that the natural impression should arise in his mind, "Excellent aunt! She embarrasses herself to benefit me." The reader now fully understands how complete a mistress of duplicity, hypocrisy, and deceit was the widow of Old Burlington Street. Beneath that calm and placid demeanour, under that veil of sanctity, raged the most ardent lusts and agitated the most selfish feelings. She was a living, walking, breathing lie. Her existence was one immense falsehood. And yet so well did she maintain the semblance of even the sternest virtue, that her real character was known only to two persons, Sir Henry Courtenay, and another whom it is not at present necessary to name. End of Section 34. Read by Céline Major. Section 35 of the Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Céline Major. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. Section 35. Mr. Sheepshanks. In a large room on a first floor in St. Martin's Lane, some 300 or 400 persons, male and female, were assembled. At one end of the apartment was a raised platform, in the middle of which stood a capacious arm-chair behind a desk, and on the said platform several sleek, oily, comfortable-looking gentlemen, all dressed in black, and wearing white cravats with no shirt-collars, were grouped together in conversation. The body of the room was occupied by chairs for the accommodation of those who had front-seat tickets, and forms for those who possessed back-seat tickets. It is a remarkable fact that the votaries of the Established Church invariably create social distinctions in the very places instituted to propagate or maintain their creed. Thus every church belonging to the Establishment had its pews for the rich and its pauper seats; and in the assembly rooms of the religious associations the same distinction is drawn between aristocracy and democracy. And these lines of demarcation are traced by men practising, or rather pretending to practise, a religion which proclaims that all are equal in the eyes of God. Oh, the vile hypocrisy of these canting psalm-singers! The room to which we have introduced our readers was well lighted with wax candles, and had two cheerful fires blazing away in the grates. The atmosphere was warm, there were no unpleasant draughts, and the floor was covered with a thick drugget. For your religious people are mightily fond of comfort, and comfort was certainly studied at the offices of the South Sea Islands Bible Circulating Society. In the second row of the "front seat ticket" department sat Mrs. Slingsby and the Misses Torrens. The two latter had their veils carefully drawn over their faces, for Mrs. Slingsby had insisted upon their accompanying her to this pious and soul-refreshing entertainment, as they had not previously stirred out of doors from the moment they had taken up their abode with her. At 6:15, two ushers, bearing white wands, passed up the room, preceding a short, stout, brandy-faced gentleman, who tried to look as demure and humble as he could, but who could not, however, subdue that consciousness of importance which seems to say, "Ah, now I am causing a sensation." And a sensation, too, he produced, sure enough; for the gentlemen began clapping their hands and stamping on the floor, while the ladies waved their handkerchiefs as if he were some victorious general who had just defeated a French army of 100,000 men. Upon reaching the platform, the brandy faced gentleman shook hands with the sleek and oily individuals before alluded to, and the "sensation" became more exciting on the part of the spectators, as if it were a very clever thing indeed to shake hands in public. Then the brandy faced man stepped a few paces back, and pretended to enter into very earnest conversation with some leading member of the committee, while another member moved, in a drawling sing song tone, that their respected president, Mr. Jonathan Pugwash, do take the chair. This proposal was received with renewed applause, and the brandy faced gentleman, for it was he who delighted in the euphonious name of Pugwash, started as if quite astonished that such an honour should have been destined for him. He then proceeded to establish himself in the large armchair before mentioned, and, in a voice which sounded as if he were talking inside a barrel, called upon "their respected friend, the Reverend Malachi Sawkins, to open the meeting with prayer." Mr. Sawkins, a very demure looking man indeed, proceeded to drawl out a long extempore prayer, in the course of which he led his audience to infer that Heaven favoured that particular society more than all others, and when he had concluded, the chairman rose to explain the object of the extraordinary assembly that evening, although the said object was already well known to every individual present, ay, and to every soul who, passing up or down St. Martin's Lane, might choose to stop and peruse the enormous bills placarded at the entrance. Mr. Jonathan Pugwash commenced by expressing his thanks for the high honour done him by selecting him to preside over that meeting, an honour the more distinguished inasmuch as it had been perfectly unexpected on his part. This was completely false, it having been settled in committee 3 days previously that he was to preside on this occasion, but your zealots do not mind a white lie at times. He was well aware of his own unworthiness, cries of "No, no." Yes, he was an unworthy vessel, but he hoped the Lord would sustain him in the onerous duty thrust upon him. Amen, in a hollow, sepulchral tone from the Reverend Malachi Sawkins. He thanked the ladies and gentlemen, or he should rather say his Christian sisters and brethren present, for the kind, the handsome, the feeling manner in which they had contradicted his expressed belief of his own unworthiness. Cheers and "Go it, Pugwash!" from a drunken gentleman in a remote corner of the room. He need scarcely inform the highly respectable and influential meeting then and there assembled, that the object of such assembly on that occasion was to hear certain accounts of the progress of the good cause from the lips of a revered brother, Cheers, who had just returned (renewed cheers) from a long, more cheering, arduous, prolonged cheering, and most perilous, vociferous cheering, mission to the islands of the South Seas, tremendous cheering, mingled with "Bravo!" from the drunken gentleman in the remote corner. He need scarcely say that he alluded to their dear, venerated, respected, highly prized, gifted, talented, persevering friend, Mr. Sheepshanks. Cheers! With these few observations he would introduce Mr. Sheepshanks to the meeting. Prolonged cheering. The chairman sat down in an awful state of perspiration, but in another moment he rose again, for a little door at the back of the platform had just been opened by one of the ushers, and behold, Joshua Sheepshanks appeared before the enraptured spectators. It would be impossible to describe the enthusiasm which now prevailed in the room. The cheering was tremendous. The waving of the ladies' handkerchiefs created a perfect gale of chill air, and the drunken gentleman in the corner shouted so vociferously that one old lady who sat near him would certainly have fainted, as she subsequently observed, if another old lady next to her had not happened, by the merest accident in the whole world, to have a small flask of cognac in her muff, and most charitably to place the said flask at her disposal. Mr. Sheepshanks was a tall, thin, sallow-faced man, with black hair combed sleekly over his forehead, and sharp, piercing grey eyes which seldom settled anywhere, but when they did, it happened, singularly enough, that they were sure to fix themselves on the prettiest faces in the room. Order being restored, Mr. Sheepshanks rose to address the audience. Having expressed his gratitude for the truly Christian reception he had received, he entered upon the subject so dear to all who had the good cause at heart. He stated that in the year 1823 the committee of the society had determined to send a missionary to some of the South Sea Islands to pave the way for the effectual carrying out of the objects of the association. A sum of £500 was voted for the purpose, and he, Mr. Sheepshanks, had offered himself as a willing sacrifice to the good cause, although, as he perfectly well knew, at the risk of being roasted and eaten by the savages amongst whom he was to venture. Understanding that a French ship was to sail for the South Seas from Cherbourg on an exploring expedition, he had repaired to that port, and had taken a passage in the vessel alluded to. In due time, and after experiencing tremendous weather, the ship touched at the Cape of Good Hope, and thence proceeded towards the Southern Islands. "It was on the 14th of March, 1824," continued Mr. Sheepshanks, "that we anchored off the beautiful island of Squizzleocoo, and I fell on my knees on the deck, to return thanks to that Providence which had at length brought me within sight of the scene of my labours. A refreshing influence came over me, and my heart leapt, like a porpoise on the wide waters, at the cheering thought that I was about to render myself useful amongst the benighted savages so near at hand. A boat was lowered, and the captain, the third mate, the purser, and myself were rowed ashore. I was provided with my Bible, the captain and the mate took with them quantities of looking-glasses, buttons, and toys, and the ungodly purser armed himself with a bottle of rum. An awful groan burst from the Reverend Mr. Sapiens, whereat Mr. Pugwash, who had fallen asleep, woke up. "Yes, dear Christian friends," exclaimed Mr. Sheepshanks, "a bottle of rum!" "And no fool he!" cried the drunken gentleman in the corner. "Order, order!" vociferated Mr. Pugwash, rubbing his eyes. At this crisis, a gentleman of foreign appearance, well dressed, and adorned with a pair of very fierce moustachios, advanced from the body of the room towards the platform; but at every 3 steps he took, he paused for a few moments to examine Mr. Sheepshanks with strict scrutiny by the aid of an eyeglass. At first he seemed uncertain relative to some idea which had entered his head; but the nearer he approached the platform, and the more closely he examined Mr. Sheepshanks, the fainter became his doubts and the stronger his suspicions. At last, just as the missionary was about to resume the history of his adventures in respect to the island of Squizzleocoo, the foreign stranger leaped upon the platform, confronted the pious gentleman, and said in an ironical tone, "How do you do, Monsieur Sheepshang? Me ver much delight to see you this once again." Mr. Sheepshanks seemed confounded at the sudden apparition of the foreign gentleman, but speedily recovering his self-possession, he said, "Really, sir, you have the advantage of me; but if you will step into the private office, behind there, for a short time, I——" "Oh, yes, you really have de advantage on me, Monsieur Sheepshang," interrupted the foreigner; "but you no get it again, do you see? How do, Madame Sheepshang, and the little Sheepshang as was born at my house?" "This gentleman, sir," said the Reverend Mr. Sapiens, addressing the foreigner in a tone of awful solemnity, and pointing towards Mr. Sheepshanks, "is not married and has no children. His life is devoted to celibacy and good works." "Good works!" ejaculated the Frenchman. "Den what for he come and swindle me?" "Oh!" groaned the Reverend Mr. Sapiens, holding up his hands in horror at the supposed baseness of the imputation against the most savoury vessel of the whole society. "Oh!" reverberated in a long echoing groan throughout the room, for, as the reader may suppose, this strange scene had excited a powerful sensation amongst all present. "Ah, it all ver well!" exclaimed the Frenchman, indignant at the awful groaning with which his words were received; "but let this fellow Sheepshang look me in the face, and——" "Call in a constable!" roared Pugwash, the chairman. "Give the Frenchman fair play!" cried several voices. "Dat is all me do ask of the British public," said the Frenchman. But while he turned to address those words to the audience, Mr. Sheepshanks disappeared with remarkable abruptness by the private door at the back of the platform. "Where's our reverend brother?" demanded Mr. Pugwash, looking anxiously around. "I'm afraid he must be taken ill," returned Mr. Sawkins. "I will go and see." And this reverend gentleman followed the pious missionary. The Frenchman then proceeded to acquaint the audience that he kept an hotel at Cherbourg, where Mr. Sheepshanks arrived at the beginning of the year 1823; that the reverend gentleman continued to reside with him for upward of 10 months, spending money as profusely as if he possessed the purse of Fortunatus; that at the expiration of that period Mr. Sheepshanks departed, but returned at the end of a month, accompanied by a lady whom he represented to be his wife, and who presented him with a pledge of her affection some 11 months afterwards; that Mr. Sheepshanks and the lady, with the child, continued to honour the hotel with their presence until the middle of the year 1826, when they suddenly evaporated, leaving behind them a heavy bill unpaid, and a portmanteau full of stones and straw, that business had brought the Frenchman to London, and curiosity had induced him to enter that assembly upon reading the placard, wherein the euphonious name of Sheepshanks prominently figured, at the door. This narrative produced, as may be supposed, an extraordinary sensation amongst the saints gathered together on this occasion. And no wonder. Was it, then, all a fabrication relative to Mr. Sheepshanks' visit to the South Sea Islands? Had he never proceeded farther than Cherbourg? Were the funds of the society lavished in riotous living and on a mistress? Was it the better to carry out the deception that he had pretended to sail in a French ship, instead of an English one? Was he, in a word, an unmitigated impostor? And were all the members of the society his dupes? These opinions seemed to be confirmed when the Reverend Mr. Sawkins came back with the astounding intelligence that Mr. Sheepshanks was nowhere to be found in any part of the society's offices. Mrs. Slingsby was overwhelmed with grief, and her 2 fair companions with astonishment; and as they rode home in a hackney coach, the pious widow never ceased from dilating on the tremendous injury which the good cause would receive from the exposure of the flagrant turpitude of Mr. Sheepshanks. End of Section 35. Read by Céline Major. Section 37 of the Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Céline Major. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. Section 37. Tom Rain and Jacob. It was Saturday evening, and Rainford was proceeding up Gray's Inn Lane, wrapped in his white greatcoat, and with a woollen comforter reaching up almost to his nose, when he suddenly felt some one pull him by the sleeve. He turned round, and by the light of the lamp beheld the lad Jacob. "Well, you young rascal!" exclaimed Tom, but with anger more affected than real; for he was not a man to cherish vindictive feelings towards an enemy so utterly unworthy his resentment as that pale, weak, and sickly boy. "I wonder you have the face to accost me, after joining in that abominable scheme to intrude upon the privacy of my dwelling 3 or 4 nights ago." "I hope you will forgive me, Mr. Rainford," said the lad; "for you must know," added he emphatically, "it wasn't altogether my fault. I was bound to obey the man who gave me food. But do you know, sir, what has become of him? Oh, Mr. Rainford, I am well aware that he did deserve punishment at your hands, but pray forgive me. I hope—" "You hope that I did not kill him?" said the highwayman, in a deep, hollow-toned voice. "Why, do you suppose that I am a likely person to commit murder, intentionally?" "Oh, no, no!" replied the boy. "And yet——" "And yet what?" asked Rainford. "And yet it is so strange that he should never have been seen at any of his usual haunts," added Jacob. "Come along with me," said Rainford abruptly. "We cannot stand talking in the street, and I want to have some conversation with you. But do you know any place close at hand—any public house, I mean—where we could have a private room for an hour or so?" "Yes, sir," replied Jacob, after a moment's reflection. "This way." He turned abruptly down into a narrow, dark, dirty thoroughfare, called Baldwin's Gardens, and conducted the highwayman into a low public house, where, upon inquiry, they were immediately accommodated with a private room on the second floor. Rainford ordered the fire to be lighted and a bottle of wine to be brought up; and when these instructions were complied with, he renewed the conversation with Jacob. "And so nothing has been heard of Old Death?" he said, in as tranquil a manner as he could assume. "Nothing," replied Jacob. "A man named Josh Pedler called at Bunce's this morning early, and wanted to see Mr. Bones on account of a thief known as Tim the Snammer, who was to go up before the magistrate to day; and it appears that Mr. Bones had promised to get him off. Pedler was in a dreadful way when he heard that we hadn't seen anything of the old man for 2 or 3 days, and he swore that it was all a hoax, and that Bones wanted to stick to the money that had been paid him and shirk the job. Then comes a girl about an hour afterwards, and she said she was Tim the Snammer's wife. Mutton-faced Sal they call her, and a deuce of a rumpus she made also." "Do you know a person called Tidmarsh?" demanded Rainford, after a few moments' reflection, for he was anxious to learn if the boy were acquainted with the establishments in Turnmill and Red Lion Streets. "I know him by name very well, and that's all," replied Jacob. "He is a fence, and lives somewhere in Clerkenwell. But pray tell me, Mr. Rainford, if you know what has become of the old man." "I can tell you nothing about him, my boy," said the highwayman. "Surely he was not so very kind to you?" "He kind? Oh! no—far from that," cried Jacob, in a tone of evident sincerity. "But I was so dependent on him, that, unless I turn thief again, as I once was——" He stopped short and burst into tears. "My poor lad," said Tom Rain, affected by this ebullition of grief on the part of the wretched boy, "if you are afraid of wanting bread, you may banish those alarms—at least for the present." And he threw a handful of sovereigns upon the table. "Are these for me?" cried Jacob, scarcely able to believe his eyes. "Yes, every one of them," answered the highwayman; "but on this condition—that you tell me how Old Death discovered my late abode in Lock's Fields, and what was his object in entering it along with you and that sneaking fellow Toby Bunce." "I will tell you all—everything I know, Mr. Rainford," exclaimed Jacob. "But," he added slowly, "you will find that I do not deserve this kindness at your hands." "I can scarcely blame you for obeying the person on whom you were dependent," said the highwayman. "Come, gather up the money, and make haste with your information." As Jacob secured the gold about his person, his dark eyes were lighted up, and his cheeks were flushed with a glow of animation. "I can tell you much more than you suppose, Mr. Rainford," he resumed in a few moments; "and if I begin at the proper place, what I have to say will go farther back than the affair the other night in Lock's Fields." "Then begin with the beginning, Jacob," said Tom, lighting a cigar. "There—drink another glass of wine, and now fire away. But mind and tell me nothing save the truth—for I shall soon see if you are deceiving me." "I won't deceive you, Mr. Rainford," cried the boy, "and will soon convince you that I am in earnest. Besides, it is my interest to make a friend of you, even if it wasn't my inclination. And now to begin. You remember the morning you was had up at Bow Street? Well, Old Death had told me to watch you when you came out of Tullock's—to dog you about—to find out where you lived and anything else I could glean concerning you." "What was that for?" demanded Tom. "He did not tell me then," answered Jacob; "but I have ascertained since, and you will be able to guess by and by. Well, I did follow you that morning. I saw you nabbed by Dykes, the runner, and I went up to Bunce's to tell Old Death what had happened. Then he cut off to Watkins and Burtonshaw, who came and bailed you. I was ordered to watch about the police court, and see where you went to, and I followed you to Pall Mall. Then I dogged you back again, and when the Jewess's case was over, I lost sight of you somehow or another." "And you duly made your report to Old Death?" said Tom inquiringly. "Of course," replied Jacob. 2 or 3 days afterwards I was set to watch you again, when you left Bunce's one afternoon; and I followed you down to an eating house in the Strand. You stayed there about 2 hours, and at length you came out with a tall, handsome young gentleman." "Ah! I recollect," cried the highwayman. It was Clarence Villiers. But go on, my boy."
"I only mention all these little things to convince you that I am telling the exact truth," said Jacob. "Well, from the Strand I followed you and the gentleman as far as Bridge Street, Blackfriars, where you parted. I dogged you, Mr. Rainford, over to the Elephant and Castle Tavern, where you met a lady and the little boy."
"Yes, Charley Watts," ejaculated the highwayman, gradually becoming more interested in Jacob Smith's narrative, because each successive step thereof afforded fresh evidence of its truth.
"You joined the lady and the little boy," continued Jacob; "and when you all stopped for a short time at the window of a jeweller's shop, the lady lifted up her veil, and I knew her again."
"Ah!" cried Tom, with a sudden start.
"Yes, sir, I recognized Miss Esther de Medina. But are you angry, sir? Have I said anything to offend you?"
"No, no, Jacob," returned the highwayman, the cloud which had gathered upon his countenance suddenly disappearing. "Go on, my boy."
"Then I saw you take the lady and the little boy into the shop, and you bought a pair of earrings, which you gave to the lady; and as you came out again I heard you say to her, 'This present is a kind of recompense for the diamonds which I made you give up,' or something to the same meaning."
"Yes, I remember that I did make use of those or similar words," cried Rainford. "But how the deuce did it happen that I never once caught a glimpse of you?"
"Oh, sir, I acted with so much caution," replied the lad, "and then you did not suspect that you was watched."
"True," said Tom thoughtfully. "And of course you reported all this to Old Death?"
"I followed you on to Lock's Fields, and then returned to Seven Dials, where I told Mr. Bones and Mrs. Bunce all I had seen and heard."
"And what did they say? Tell me everything, Jacob," exclaimed the highwayman.
"They seemed very much surprised to think that you and Miss Esther were intimate together."
Jacob suddenly paused, for again did a dark cloud overspread Tom Rain's countenance. "Go on, Jacob," he said, observing that the lad was alarmed. "I am subject to a sudden pain, but it is nothing at all. Go on, I say. You were telling me that Old Death and that disgusting woman, Mrs. Bunce, were very much astonished at a certain circumstance. Well, and what did they say?"
"They asked me whether either you, sir, or the lady took any little thing, when the jeweller's back was turned," replied Jacob timidly; "but I assured them that you did not."
A scornful smile curled the highwayman's lips, and then he puffed away violently at his cigar, apparently wrapped in deep reflection.
"Shall I tell you any more, sir?"
asked Jacob, when a few minutes of profound silence had elapsed. "Yes, my boy, go on," cried Tom, turning towards him again.
"The very next night," resumed Jacob, "Mr. Bones and me were walking down Southampton Row, Russell Square, you know, when I observed Miss Esther de Medina in a shop."
"Where there was a post office?" ejaculated the highwayman hastily.
"Just so, sir, and she was reading a letter," continued Jacob. "Then me and Old Death followed her down to another post office. It was in Holborn, where she posted a letter which she had with her. I crept close up to her, and saw the address on it just before she dropped it into the box."
"And what was that address?" demanded Rainford.
"Tr. No. 5, Brandon Street, Lock's Fields," was the answer.
"And you of course told that to Old Death?"
"Yes, and he desired me to follow the lady to see where she lived, which I did, and traced her to Great Ormond Street. Then I went back to Bunce's and acquainted Mr. Bones with this fact also. He was very much pleased, and soon afterwards you came in. He then told you about going to Shooter's Hill to stop a tradesman and his wife, but I afterwards found out that it was only a gag to get you out of the way next night."
"Ah, I thought as much!" cried Rainford. "And now I suppose we come to the visit which Mr. Bones, Toby Bunce, and yourself paid to my lodgings?"
"Exactly so," said Jacob. "Early the next morning I was ordered by Old Death to post myself all day long in Great Ormond Street, and see that Miss Esther didn't go out. I kept watch, and saw her several times at the window just for a moment, so I knew she was at home. In the evening Old Death and Mr. Bunce came and fetched me, and we went over to a public house opposite your lodgings in Brandon Street. On the way I learnt what they meant to do, for it was to carry off the boy." "Poor little Charley Watts!"
ejaculated Rainford, totally unprepared for this announcement. But what harm had he done to them, or what could they want with him?
"I don't exactly know, sir," replied Jacob. "Indeed, I don't think Toby Bunce knew himself; but I can't help thinking that it was somehow or another connected with a certain letter which Old Death let fall, and which I picked up and kept. It bears the signature of Sarah Watts."
"The poor woman who died at Bunce's house!" cried the highwayman. "Where is that letter?"
"Here, sir," answered Jacob; and with these words he produced the document from his pocket, and handed it to Tom Rain.
The highwayman hastened to peruse it with the greatest interest and attention; but he was evidently disappointed when he perceived that it afforded no clue to the person to whom it was originally intended to be sent. "I shall keep this letter, Jacob," he said, after some minutes of profound reflection.
"Do so, Mr. Rainford," returned the lad. "And now you see that I am acting sincerely with you."
"Quite," remarked the highwayman, in an absent manner; for he suddenly remembered the circumstance of Old Death declaring that he had lost a particular letter on the memorable night which was marked with so many strange occurrences. "Yes, Jacob," he continued after a long pause, "you are right. It must have been in connexion with this letter that the old man wanted to carry off the boy. Perhaps he had discovered some clue to unravel the mystery of Charlie's birth, and meant to turn the secret to his own advantage. But if so, he must have had some better trace than this letter, which certainly says a great deal, and yet leaves the one grand point—who Charlie's mother really is—in complete darkness. However," added Tom, who had been musing aloud rather than addressing his remarks to Jacob, "time will perhaps clear up all."
"You see, sir," continued Jacob, "I was set to watch in Great Ormond Street to find out whether Miss Esther went over to you."
"To me!" ejaculated Rainford, as if taken by surprise. "But go on, my boy, go on."
"And as I knew that she was at home when Old Death and Toby Bunce came to join me there," pursued the lad, "we of course thought it was all right. You may therefore judge how Old Death and me were surprised when we went up into the bedroom at your lodgings——"
"Enough of that, Jacob," cried Rainford, starting uneasily. "And now tell me why Old Death seemed so anxious all along to find out everything he could about me."
"Lord, sir, can't you guess?" exclaimed the boy. "He knew that you could be useful to him, and he wanted to get you completely into his power. By knowing all that concerned you, he——"
"I understand, Jacob," again interrupted the highwayman; "and it is just as I suspected. You are a good lad for telling me all this, and I will not leave you to want—in case," he added hastily, "your old master should not happen to turn up again. But I do not think I shall stay many days in London, Jacob. However, I will see you again shortly, and we will have a talk together about what is best to be done for you. One word, by the bye. Do you know how this letter which you gave me happened to fall into Old Death's hands?"
"Not at all, sir, unless Mr. Bunce found it about the poor woman who died the other night at her house."
"That is what I suspect," observed Rainford. "Indeed, it must have been so. The deceitful woman! After my paying her so handsomely to keep back the document. But it has found its way to my pocket at last, in spite of her and Old Death. And now, Jacob, tell me about yourself. How long have you been in the service of Mr. Benjamin Jones?"
"I wish you had time, sir," said the boy, "to listen to my story. It would be a relief for me to tell it; for I already feel towards you as I never felt to any one before. Indeed, I was sorry to be employed against you in any way, but I couldn't help myself. I remember the evening that I watched you over to Lock's Fields. I was so moved, I hardly can describe how, at seeing that little boy Charlie with you; for I thought how good you were towards him, and what an excellent heart you must have; and when I got back to Bunce's, I couldn't pluck up courage to tell Old Death anything about you, for fear he might mean you some injury. However," added Jacob, wiping his eyes, "he did get it all out of me at last." "Never mind, my lad," interrupted Rainford, moved by Jacob's contrition. "All you have told me this evening has fully atoned for the mischief you previously did me. Besides, as I before said, you were forced to obey your master. And now," he added, after referring to his handsome gold repeater, "I don't mind if I sit another hour with you here, and while I smoke my cigar,
You shall tell me the history of your life."
"I will, sir," exclaimed the boy eagerly; "but I warn you beforehand it is a long one. That is, if I tell it as I should like to do."
"Tell it in your own way, my boy," cried Rainford, "and never mind the length." The highwayman settled himself in a comfortable manner in his chair, and Jacob proceeded to relate the history of his life. Section 38 of the Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Céline Major. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. Section 38. The History of Jacob Smith. Part 1. My earliest recollections are associated with the occupation of playing all day long in the streets, in company with other infants. This was in Upper Whitecross Street, St. Luke's, where I and those other children lived with a woman who pretended to keep a boarding school at which she received children to live with her all together for 1 shilling and 8d. a week each. But she used to turn us all out early in the morning with a piece of hard mouldy bread to nibble for our breakfast, and fetch us home again when it grew dusk in the evening. She would then give us another piece of bread for supper, and we went to bed. But what a bed! A few old sacks thrown over a heap of straw in a little room about 6 feet long by 4½ in width served upwards of a dozen children as a sleeping room. There we used to cry ourselves to rest, famished with insufficiency of food, and awake again in the morning to undergo fresh privations. I said there were about 12 of us under the care of this Mother Maggs, as she was called. They chiefly belonged to very poor parents, who were engaged all day long at work, and were therefore glad to get rid of their children who would otherwise only be an encumbrance to them. Some few were, however, the illegitimate offspring of poor servant girls in place; but nearly all had parents who came to see them from time to time and perhaps gave them a few pence. I was not, however, so fortunate as the rest, for no one ever came to see me—at least that I was aware of—until I was about 9 years old, and I heard that the 20d. a week allowed for my board and lodging was left regularly for Mother Maggs at the neighbouring chandler's shop every Saturday morning. Mother Maggs seemed to think that I had really no friends, for though she bullied us all pretty well, she bullied me 10,000 times more than the rest. The habit of turning a dozen little children, some of whom were only just able to walk, into the street the way I have described, was not likely to be always unattended with disagreeable consequences. Sometimes the child was run over, and either severely wounded or killed. In the latter case, no coroner's inquest ever sat on the body. The exposure of Mother Maggs's neglect towards us would have drawn the attention of the parochial authorities towards her. But when a death happened in that way, the old woman used to put the body into a sack and carry it some distance into the country, where she would sink it in a pond or ditch. Often, however, the corpse of a dead child has been allowed to remain in our room till it was quite putrid, Mother Maggs not having time or inclination to remove it before. And on those occasions, we who were alive in that room were so frightened to be with the dead body in the dark, that we shrieked and screamed till the noise reached the old woman's ears in the public house next door, and so savage was she at being disturbed in her gin and her gossip, that she has half murdered us by way of making us hold our tongues. Sometimes the child was lost, and if the parents, on being informed of it, expressed regret or anger, Mother Maggs would take some trouble to find it again. If not, she did not put herself out of the way respecting the matter. In addition to her boarding house for children, she let out lodgings to persons of either sex; and, as she was not particular so long as she got paid, her house was nothing more or less than a common brothel. She was always saying she had no time to do anything which ought to be done; and, if being all day in the public house was a necessary duty, she certainly had no time for other purposes. Though not often tipsy, she was never actually sober, but in a constant state of muzziness. Liquor did not improve her temper. On the contrary, it made her irritable, sometimes ferocious;
and I have seen her fight with other women until her face was covered with long seams made by the finger nails and pouring with blood. You cannot suppose that all these things which I have just told you, or that I am going to tell you directly, in connection with Mother Maggs's establishment, were noticed or understood by me when I was quite a child there. But you must remember that I stayed at that den until I was 9, and in the course of those years all I saw made a deep impression on my mind; and what was then dark and unintelligible to me has since been made clear and plain by experience and by reflection on those scenes and circumstances. You will wonder how my wretched companions and myself managed to live, since we only had a piece of bread each night and morning. We kept body and soul together in a variety of ways, chiefly feeding, like swine, upon all the offal and remnants of vegetables, cooked or raw, that we found in the street. There was a dust-bin in the court where Mother Maggs's house was in Whitecross Street, and every day, just upon 1 o'clock, we used to crowd round it, waiting till the neighbours came to empty their potato peelings or the refuse of their meals into that general receptacle. Then we would greedily appropriate to our use the scraps which not even the very poorest of the poor chose to eat. The potato peelings (most poor families skin their potatoes after they are boiled) were quite a dainty to us. The heads and bones of fish and such like refuse were also welcome to our empty stomachs. Then we were accustomed to go prowling about the street to snatch a slice of raw bacon or a bit of cheese from the board in front of a butter shop, or steal a turnip or a carrot from an old woman's stall, or else lay unlawful hands upon the horse's flesh and the cat's meat shops. This last article of food was much fancied by us. It was comparatively easy to steal, and when we did get such a prize as a large lump of carrion, with a stick thrust through it, we felt as happy for the time being as if we had found a treasure. Then we used to conceal ourselves in some dark court and take a bite round, each in his turn, until it was all gone. I am afraid I disgust you with these details, but you desired me to tell my story in my own way, and I want you to understand the dreadful mode of life which thousands of poor children lead in the wealthiest city in the world. I am sure, when I have thought of it all since, and when I see little boys and girls paddling in that neglected manner about the streets, my blood runs cold at the idea that while some human beings are riding in their carriages and living in palaces, others are prowling in the low neighbourhoods, happy if they can steal a lump of putrid carrion. You may next ask what we did for clothes, it being very clear that Mother Maggs could not supply us with wearing apparel out of 20d. a week. Well, the fact is, we scarcely had any clothes on at all. As for cap or shoes and stockings, I declare solemnly I never wore any one of those articles from the earliest period of my recollection until I was 9 years old. A little ragged frock, and that was all. Yes, that was all, summer or winter. But where did even the ragged frock come from? I really hardly know. I am at a loss to say exactly how we did get even that one garment each. Sometimes a child would be taken away by its parents, who might, perhaps, bring it some decent clothing. Then the cast-off rags in this case would fall to the lot of the most ragged of those who were left behind. Now and then a slop-seller in the neighbourhood would give one of us some old frock which was useless to himself, and occasionally we would steal one when we could. You may ask me why we did not steal shoes also? So we did, if an opportunity served. But then we could do without shoes, and the eldest of the lot of us was on those occasions commissioned to sell the plunder at a rag shop, to afford means to buy a little better food than usually fell in our way. These occurrences were, however, rare, so rare that they constituted perfect holidays in the hideous monotony of our famished lives. For the shopkeepers in poor neighbourhoods are constantly on the alert to watch the movements of the juvenile prowlers. The ages of the children under the care of Mother Maggs averaged from 3 to 10, and the eldest of course bullied the youngest, while Mrs. Maggs bullied us all. Misery did not make us little ones friendly together. On the contrary, we fought, quarrelled, and ill-treated each other as much as we could. I must relate to you one anecdote, although I now shudder when I think of it, and have often since shed tears of repentance. There was one boy, named Tib Tucker, about 8 years old, who used to behave in a more merciless manner towards me than the rest did. He would take away my bread from me whenever he caught me eating it apart and alone, and he laid to me many thefts on Mother Maggs's cupboard which he himself committed. These false reports got me many and many a good beating from the enraged hag, and, in a word, this boy's tyranny became so insufferable that I was resolved to adopt some desperate measure to put an end to it. I was then but little more than 6 years old. A fiendish instinct of revenge, however, urged me to act. I secreted a pin about my rags, and one day, when Tib Tucker was trying to take away the morsel of mouldy bread which Mother Maggs had just given me, I suddenly thrust the pin into his right eye. He screamed in dreadful agony, and brought down Mother Maggs into the court. I had not run away; terror, or rather horror, at what I had done, nailed me to the spot. The bully's tale was soon told. I expected to be half murdered by the dreadful woman; but, to my surprise, she suddenly took my part, declared that I had shown a proper spirit, and consoled Tib Tucker with the assurance that if he would only permit me to operate on the other eye in the same manner he would prove a perfect fortune to his parents. "There's nothing like a blind child to draw alms," she said; "but one eye's no good, you should be blind of both." I remember her words as well as if they had only been uttered yesterday, and the more so as they seemed to be prophetic, as I shall explain presently. The terrible vengeance which I had taken upon my persecutor, who lost his eye in consequence, not only awed him in future, but made me feared by all the rest, and my existence grew somewhat less wretched—at least in reference to the treatment I experienced from my companions. Mother Maggs also seemed to change towards me, whether through fear, or admiration of what she termed my spirit, I cannot say. I was less bullied by her, but not a whit better fed. About 6 weeks after the incident which I have related, the parents of Tib Tucker returned to London from the country where they had been harvesting. They passed the evening with Mother Maggs, and great quantities of gin were sent for from the public house. This I afterwards learnt from my companions, for as to myself, I kept out of the way through fear of being punished by the boy's parents for the vengeance which I had wreaked upon him. When it was quite dark, I returned to the house, and stole up to the miserable garret where my companions were already huddled together on the straw and old sacks. Tib Tucker was amongst them, for I heard him talking about a promise his parents had made to take him with them into the country, where they were going again in a few days. One of the eldest girls—for I forgot to say, Mother Maggs's juvenile boarders were of both sexes—asked him what his parents had said about the accident. He replied that they had laughed at it, and had declared that they would turn it to some good account. Scarcely had he thus spoken, when the door opened, and Mother Maggs appeared with a candle in her hand. Ordering Tib Tucker to get up and follow her, she added that his father and mother had a little treat in store for him, and had meant him all along to sit up to supper. Tib was overjoyed at these news, and made haste to accompany Mother Maggs to a lower room where she had left his parents. And we, in our miserable dark garret, envied the boy who had a good supper in view. I remember—oh, well do I remember how I cried that night, to think that no friends ever came to see me, and that indeed I was ignorant whether my parents were alive or not. I had often asked Mother Maggs whether she knew my father and mother, but I invariably received a cuff by way of reply, and therefore at length grew tired of putting the question. There were, however, times when my wretched, forlorn, abandoned condition almost broke my heart; for, young as I was, I knew that there were boys and girls in the world much better off than myself. While Tib Tucker was absent, the other children began to discourse amongst themselves, saying how lucky he was to come in for a good supper; and then they set to work to guess what the meal was likely to consist of. But all on a sudden a dreadful shriek echoed through the house, and startled us in our miserable garret. There we lay, crouching and huddling nearer to each other, holding our breath, not daring to utter a word, and filled with vague alarms, as if some dreadful danger hung over us. At length sleep came to my relief. When I awoke in the morning and ran down into the court, the first object that met my view was the wretched boy Tib Tucker being led away by his parents, for he was now blind of both eyes. I was so frightened that I ran into the street, where I wandered about all day, forgetting even the pangs of hunger. I had suddenly conceived such a dreadful terror of Mother Maggs that I had not dared to present myself at her room door to obtain my usual morsel of bread along with the rest. It was a very rainy day, and yet I remember that I roved and roved about the whole neighbourhood, at one time crying bitterly, at another stupefied, though still moving about like a sleep walker. When the evening came on, I was so tired and hungry that I was forced to retrace my way to the horrible den, which I only discovered again with the greatest difficulty. Mother Maggs did not take any notice of my absence from the morning distribution of bread, but gave me my evening ration along with the rest, and once more did I return to the straw and filth of the close garret. Months and years passed, and I reached the age of 9. The last few months opened my eyes to more wickedness than I had as yet known or dreamt of. I just now told you that Mrs. Maggs's juvenile boarders consisted of boys and girls; and I believe you understood that we all huddled together in the same garret. It was a regular pigsty, in which we wallowed like swine; and like that of brutes also was the conduct of the eldest boys and girls. If the other rooms in the house were used as a brothel by grown-up persons, no stew could be more atrocious than our garret. The girls were more precocious than the boys, and the latter were corrupted by the former. Mere children of 9 and 10 practised the vices of their elders. But, my God! let me draw a veil over this dreadful scene. Oh, sir, I have seen much, gone through much, but the mere thought of the horrible licentiousness, the beastliness, the monstrous depravity that took place there, even now makes my blood run cold in my veins. And can you wonder that such should be the case? Not one of all of us children had ever been taught what virtue was, and all that we knew of crime was that it was something which a constable took you up for. We had not the least notion of the Saviour. None of us had ever heard that the Son of God died for the sins of the world. I had once seen a Bible, because I stole one from a bookstall, and the eldest girl, who went to sell it, gathered from what was said by the persons who bought it that it was a Bible. But even I had previously known that the book was called a Bible, I should not the less have stolen it, because I could not read, and no one had ever told me at that time what the Bible really was. We had all heard of the name of God, and used it pretty often too; for oaths were familiar to us even when we could only lisp them, but we knew not who God was, and had no one to tell us, even if we had wished to learn. You may think it strange that there should be children of even 10 years old in London who are completely ignorant of everything concerning religion; but I can assure you that I have met with youths and girls of 15 or 16 who were equally in the dark in that respect. I was 9 years old when Mother Maggs one day fetched me out of the street where I was playing in the gutter with my companions, and took me into her own room, where I saw Mr. Bones for the first time. I mean the first time as far as my recollection is concerned. He looked at me a long time, and then, turning to the old woman, said, "I don't think you have taken the very best care of him." "Yes, I have," she answered. "He has had his bellyful every day of his life, bread and butter for breakfast and supper, potatoes for dinner on week days, with maybe a bit of pudding or so now and then, and always a good dinner on Sunday. Haven't you, Jacob, dear?" And as she asked me this question, she gave a terrific frown unseen by Old Death, and the meaning of which I well understood. So I muttered a "yes," and she seemed satisfied. "But I'm going to take him away all the same, Mrs. Maggs," said Mr. Bones, "because he is of an age now to be useful to me." "I hope you will recommend me where you can," cried Mother Maggs. "I do all I can to make the poor little dears happy, and if Jacob is so shabby just the very day you drop down upon us like, it's only because his new frock is in the suds; and as for shoes and stockings, It makes boys hardy to go without them." I do not remember that Old Death made any answer to these observations, because the portion of the dialogue which I have just detailed produced so deep an impression on my mind, young as I was, that had it been continued, I should most probably have recollected the rest. But this I cannot forget, that when Old Death told me to follow him, and Mother Maggs took me in her arms to embrace me at parting, I screamed with affright; for the spectacle of the blind boy instantly recurred to my memory. Old Death took me to a shop in Whitecross Street, and bought me a complete suit of clothes—shabby and mean, it is true, but royal robes compared to the rags I now threw off. And how great was my astonishment, how wild was my delight, when I was actually supplied with a pair of stockings and shoes! Never before, never since, have I known such a perfect joy as I felt at that minute. Sight restored to the blind could not be more welcome than were those articles. Not that I required them, for my feet were inured to nakedness, and to walk even on the pointed flints; but I experienced an indescribable sensation of mingled pride and satisfaction which made me supremely happy. My joy was, however, somewhat rudely interrupted by a hard blow on the head which Old Death bestowed upon me, because I dared to laugh in the fulness of my poor heart, and then I burst into tears. He cursed me for a snivelling fool, and ordered me to put on the cap which he had also bought me, and make haste to accompany him. The cap was another article of clothing till then quite strange to me, and once more my tears were succeeded by smiles. At length the purchases were complete, and I followed Old Death from the shop. But I walked as if I was tipsy. The cap seemed to be quite a weight on my head, and the shoes threatened every moment to trip me up. I have never worn skates, but I can fancy how a person must feel when he puts them on for the first time, and I imagine that my awkwardness in stockings and shoes was something of the same kind. Near the point where Upper Whitecross Street joins Old Street Road, I beheld my late companions huddled together at the mouth of a passage belonging to a pawnbroker's shop. They did not know me till I called some of them by name, and then they could not believe their eyes. I must have seemed a kind of prince to them. They instantly overwhelmed me with questions, but Old Death looked back and called me in a cross tone, and I hurried away. I declare solemnly that the tears started from my eyes as I thus separated from the companions of all my infant misery; and though I knew not whether my own fate was about to be improved, still my heart was smitten with the idea that I was leaving them behind to their wretchedness, their rags, their starvation, and their fetid den at Mother Maggs's house. Never until that instant had I experienced the least sympathy in their behalf; but then, at that moment, I felt as if I could have remained with them, and loved them. Mr. Bones conducted me to some public house—I can't recollect where it was, but I think it must have been in Brick Lane, St. Luke's—and there he ordered bread and cheese and ale. What a glorious dinner did I make that day! Never had I tasted anything so delicious before. The cheese was so nice, the bread so white and new, and the ale—it was good beyond all description. At least, so the food and drink then appeared to me, and what was better still, was that I was allowed to eat as much as I chose. When we had ended our meal, Old Death began to talk very seriously to me, for we were alone in the room together. He gave me to understand that he had found me, when quite a baby, lying on the steps of a workhouse, that he had taken me to some good, kind woman whom he knew, and who had treated me well, that afterwards he had been obliged to place me, when I was 3 years old, with Mother Maggs, and that I therefore owed everything to him. I naturally believed at the time that I was under the deepest obligations to him; and then he proceeded to inform me that I might be useful to him in certain ways, and that if I did all he told me and was a good boy, he would never desert me. I of course listened with as much respect as it was in my power or nature to show; and though I did not quite understand all he said to me, I was nevertheless impressed with the conviction that he had a right to do what he chose with me, and that I was bound to obey him. We remained some time at the public house—indeed, if I remember right, until it was dusk; because Old Death had a great deal to say to me, and I was so very young and so miserably ignorant, it was not an easy matter for him to make me understand his meaning. But there can be no doubt that he laboured to convince me of the right which certain privileged persons had to prey upon others who were not so privileged; or, in plainer terms, that whenever I could obtain a handkerchief, a purse, or any thing else worth taking, and in such a manner that there was no chance of my being detected, I was perfectly justified in availing myself of the opportunity. My morals had not been so carefully attended to, as to excite any repulsive feelings at this species of reasoning. On the contrary, having from my infancy practised the art of pilfering pudding from cooks' shops, bits of bacon from cheesemongers' windows, carrots and turnips from old women's stalls, and lumps of tripe or carrion from the boards of cats' meat establishments, I was well prepared to go a step farther. There can be no doubt that Old Death was all along aware of the real nature of Mother Maggs's house, and of the manner in which she reared the children entrusted to her. A man of his experience could not help knowing all this; and it was not probable that he was deceived by the lying statements she made to him relative to the manner in which I had been treated, although he took, as far as I recollect, no notice of her words. In fact, he had intentionally placed me in a position to learn everything that was bad—to fulfil an apprenticeship of petty vice, that I might enter on a career of crime, whereof the profits were to be his own. Taking me now in a somewhat kind manner by the hand, he led me down to St. Paul's Churchyard. Although, having hitherto lived within a mile of that place, I had never been there before. It is true that from the garret windows of Mother Maggs's dwelling, I had sometimes seen the huge dark dome surmounted by the cross which shone like gold on a bright sunny day; but I had never thought of asking what it was, nor had I any notion that it was so near. Often, too, in the silence of the night, when cold and hunger kept me awake in that